Is he serious? First class?
They laughed when the single dad settled into first class. Whispers spread about upgrades, charity miles, and how people like him didn't belong among tailored suits and silk scarves. He simply buckled his daughter's seatbelt and studied the safety card. None of them expected the pilot to say his name, because this wasn't about a seat, it was about status. Before I show you the exact moment when the captain's voice trembled over the intercom and every passenger turned toward him. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. Beneath the polished smiles and crystal glasses, something uglier was unfolding. An old belief about who deserves comfort and who should quietly stay in the back. The laughter didn't stop immediately. It lingered in the air like stale perfume. He didn't react. The single father adjusted the thin airline blanket over his daughter's knees and checked that her headphones were plugged in. His posture stayed relaxed, shoulders loose, eyes steady. No apology, no irritation, just quiet presence. Across the aisle, Graham Holloway watched him over the rim of her champagne flute. Venture capital confidence radiated from her tailored ivory suit and diamond watch. She leaned toward the man beside her and murmured something that ended with a smirk. The child felt it. Lila's fingers tugged lightly at her father's sleeve. "Dad, are we in the right seats?" Her voice was small, careful. She'd learned that tone recently, the one children use when they sense the world drawing lines they don't understand. He turned to her, expression softening. "Yeah, kiddo, we are. But they're looking at us." "I know." His lips curved gently. "Let them." Boarding continued around them. Designer carry-ons thudded into overhead bins. Expensive cologne mixed with the faint scent of jet fuel drifting in from the open door. The hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit vibrated beneath their feet, steady and mechanical. He noticed the rhythm. Most people wouldn't. They'd hear background noise. Elias heard pitch variance, slight, irregular, not alarming, just interesting. Graham's voice cut through the cabin again, louder now. "I just don't understand how upgrades work anymore." A few passengers chuckled. One woman raised an eyebrow in theatrical confusion. No one addressed him directly. They didn't need to. The exclusion was deliberate. The flight attendant, Maris Cole, approached with a practiced smile. "Welcome aboard." Her eyes lingered a fraction longer on the pair, perhaps sensing the imbalance. "Can I offer you something before departure?" "Water's great," he replied. "Apple juice, please," Lila added, trying to sound braver than she felt. Maris nodded warmly and moved away. Graham leaned back, crossing her legs. "It's amazing what loyalty points can buy these days," she said, just loud enough. The comment floated like a paper cut. Elias reached forward and pulled the safety card from the seat pocket. His thumb traced the aircraft diagram automatically. Exit rows, pressure panels, electrical routing schematics simplified for passengers, familiar design language. He'd seen early drafts of this model years ago in a very different setting. Lila watched him. "You always read that thing." "Habit. You already know it. Still good to review." Her gaze shifted toward the wide windows where ground crew moved in neon vests beneath the wing. "Are planes the same every time?" "Same basics," he said quietly. "But every flight's its own story." The engines began their low spool as the main power transitioned. A faint tremor moved through the fuselage. He listened again. There it was, slight asymmetry in startup resonance. Probably harmless calibration drift. Probably. Across the aisle, Graham tapped at her phone, irritation flickering when she realized it needed to switch to airplane mode. "Let's hope this crew knows what they're doing," she muttered. Elias glanced up briefly at that, not defensive, not offended, just measuring. Lila leaned closer. "Dad?" "Yeah? Why do people think stuff before they know you?" He considered the question longer than the engine vibration. "Because it's easier." "Easier than what?" than being curious. The cabin door sealed with a heavy mechanical thud. The outside noise softened instantly, replaced by controlled interior pressure and the faint hiss of conditioned air. Seatbelt signs chimed on. Maris demonstrated safety procedures at the front. Elias followed along without looking at the card now, mentally mapping each instruction against the aircraft's actual architecture. Graham noticed. She tilted her head slightly, studying him as if trying to categorize what didn't fit. The worn leather jacket, the practical watch, the absence of brand signals. Definitely doesn't belong, her expression said. The aircraft began its slow pushback from the gate. Through the window, the terminal glass reflected the cabin lights, creating a layered image of luxury and labor overlapping for a brief moment. Lila squeezed his hand as the plane started to taxi. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, though her grip tightened. "I've got you," he said. The engines grew louder, deeper, preparing for the runway. Conversation in first class resumed. Market updates, merger gossip, vacation homes. The earlier laughter had faded into smug normalcy, but beneath it, tension coiled quietly. He felt it in the floorboards, in the timing of the engine surge, in the almost imperceptible delay before full synchronization. His eyes lifted toward the cockpit door. Something wasn't wrong. Not yet. But it wasn't perfect either. And perfection, he knew, was the only thing keeping everyone comfortable enough to laugh. The aircraft rolled onto the runway, engines building from a steady hum into a rising roar that pressed everyone back into their seats. Lila's fingers curled tighter around the armrest. He covered her hand with his, steady and warm. "Just noise," he murmured. "Power doing its job." Across the aisle, Graham gave a dramatic sigh. "I swear every flight feels more chaotic than the last." No one responded, but a few smiled in agreement. The plane paused briefly, engines spooling to full thrust. Then acceleration slammed forward, fast and committed. The cabin vibrated with contained force. Elias listened. The left engine lagged half a breath before matching the right. Subtle. Most would never catch it. His jaw tightened slightly, though his expression stayed neutral. Rotation came smoothly, the nose lifted. The city dropped away beneath a wash of morning light. As landing gear retracted, a faint shudder rippled through the floorboards, longer than typical. Not violent, just extended. Lila glanced up at him. "That felt weird." "Different," he corrected gently. "Not weird." Graham laughed lightly. "Comforting," she muttered, clearly meaning the opposite. The climb continued. Seatbelt signs remained illuminated longer than usual. Conversation dipped as passengers sensed the uneven texture of ascent. Even those who prided themselves on elite travel experience shifted slightly in their seats. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. Air pressure equalization sounded strained, like a door seal resisting before settling. Again, not failure, but not seamless. Maris passed through the aisle, checking overhead bins. Her smile flickered when another vibration pulsed through the cabin. "Everything normal?" Graham asked her pointedly. "Completely, ma'am," Maris replied, though her tone carried professional tightness. Elias caught that. Lila leaned toward him. "Dad, you're doing that thing." "What thing?" "The thinking face." He exhaled softly. "Just paying attention." To distract her, he gestured toward the wing outside their window. "See the flaps adjusting? That's part of climb stabilization." She nodded, fascinated despite herself. A businessman seated diagonally across frowned. "How do you know that?" "Observation," he answered simply. The man shrugged, unimpressed. Altitude increased. The engine settled into cruise power, but a faint tremor remained underfoot, rhythmic and slightly off-center. Elias traced the pattern in his mind like a metronome that wouldn't quite align. Then it happened. A brief, sharp dip, barely noticeable, like hitting invisible air. Gasps fluttered through first class. Graham gripped her armrest. Unbelievable. The seatbelt sign chimed again. Captain Rowan Mercer's voice filled the cabin, calm but clipped. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing minor turbulence. Please remain seated." Minor. Elias knew the difference between turbulence and mechanical hesitation. This wasn't wind shear. It was internal recalibration struggling to stabilize. He kept that to himself. Lila swallowed. "Is it safe?" "Yes." He squeezed her hand again. "We're okay." The plane leveled at cruising altitude, but the earlier imbalance hadn't vanished. It had disguised itself beneath smoother noise. Graham leaned forward slightly, studying him again. "You seem awfully relaxed for someone who doesn't fly first class often." He met her gaze evenly. "I fly enough." She arched a brow. "Business?" "Sometimes." Her smile thinned. "Must be nice." He didn't answer. The cabin crew began beverage service, perhaps earlier than planned, a distraction technique. Glassware clinked, ice shifted in crystal tumblers. Artificial normalcy resumed, but he could feel it building. Not catastrophic, not yet. Just a misalignment that would either self-correct or escalate when systems demanded more from each other. He leaned slightly toward the aisle as Maris passed again. "Is the captain available for a quick word?" he asked quietly. Her expression shifted, alert but cautious. "About?" "Just a question about this aircraft model." She hesitated. "I can check." Graham let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "You're going to critique the plane now?" He didn't respond. Maris disappeared toward the galley. Lila looked up at him. "Are we in trouble?" "No," he said carefully. "But sometimes it helps to mention things early." "Like what?" "Like when something doesn't sound exactly right." She studied his face, trusting. The intercom clicked faintly from the cockpit, then silence again. A beat too long. Around them, first-class passengers resumed their quiet superiority, discussing quarterly returns, art auctions, offshore expansions. Wealth insulated them from fear, or so they believed. Elias felt the aircraft shift ever so slightly again, this time accompanied by a brief flicker in the overhead lights. There. That wasn't turbulence. Graham noticed the flicker too, her champagne glass stilled mid-air. "What was that?" someone whispered. The engines maintained thrust, but beneath the surface hum lay strain, a system compensating for imbalance somewhere deep within layered avionics. He rose halfway from his seat before remembering the sign was on, sat back down. Maris reappeared, tension now unmistakable in her posture. "The captain would like to know what your concern is, sir." He kept his voice low. "There's a synchronization delay in the left engine response. Feels like avionics crosstalk. If I'm right, it won't stay minor." Her eyes widened slightly. Behind them, Graham scoffed. "Oh, please." The cabin lights flickered again, longer this time, and somewhere beyond the reinforced cockpit door, an alarm began to pulse. The alarm didn't blare. It pulsed, sharp, controlled, repeating from somewhere beyond the cockpit door like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Conversations in first class thinned into uneasy silence. The overhead lights steadied, but the earlier flicker lingered in everyone's memory. Lila's hand slid back into his, smaller now, colder. "What's that sound?" she whispered. "System alert," he said quietly. "Doesn't mean danger. Just means the plane's talking." Across the aisle, Graham shifted upright, composure cracking for the first time. "That doesn't sound minor." No one answered her. The aircraft maintained altitude, but Elias felt the subtle resistance beneath the floor. A drag not aerodynamic but computational. Something in the aircraft's network was hesitating, recalculating, trying to reconcile conflicting data streams. Maris appeared again, this time without the polished ease. "Sir," she said softly, crouching slightly to meet his eye level. "The captain is reviewing diagnostics. He asked what made you think it was synchronization." He spoke calmly, aware that every word carried weight now. The delay during takeoff rotation, extended landing gear vibration, the pressure seal hesitation, it's layered, not isolated. She swallowed. "You're certain?" "I'm confident." Behind them, Graham leaned forward openly now. "Confident about what? You're not crew." He didn't look at her. "No." Another pulse of alarm echoed faintly, followed by a mechanical chime that didn't belong to passenger notifications. A businessman unbuckled instinctively before the seatbelt sign chimed louder in warning. Captain Mercer's voice returned over the intercom, smoother than the alarm, but tighter than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are addressing a minor avionics discrepancy. Please remain seated." Avionics discrepancy. That confirmed it. Elias exhaled slowly. The plane gave a barely perceptible yaw to the left, corrected almost immediately. The correction was too sharp, automated systems compensating aggressively. Lila leaned closer. "Dad." "I know." Graham's polished certainty was fading. "I want transparency," she said sharply toward Maris. "We deserve to know what's happening." Maris maintained professionalism, but her gaze flicked back to him. She was weighing something, protocol versus intuition. He made the decision for her. "Tell the captain," he said quietly. "If it's cross-channel interference between engine control and navigation redundancy, there's a manual stabilization bridge built into this model." Her brows knit. "How would you—" "Just tell him." Another tremor ran through the fuselage, slightly stronger. A glass tipped somewhere behind them, shattering against the aisle floor. Gasps erupted. The aircraft dipped. Not violently, but enough to erase the illusion of luxury. Oxygen masks did not deploy. That meant containment. But the autopilot was fighting something. Captain Mercer's voice didn't return this time. Instead, the alarm beyond the cockpit shifted in tempo, faster now. Graham gripped her armrest, knuckles whitening. "This is unacceptable." Elias rose halfway again, steadier this time. "You should go," he told Maris gently. "Now." She hesitated only a second before turning toward the galley and disappearing through the reinforced door. Silence thickened in the cabin except for engine roar and distant warning tones. Lila looked up at him with wide eyes. "You know this plane, don't you?" He met her gaze. "Yes." "How?" He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I used to work with systems like this." Another sharper jolt cut through the cabin. Overhead bins rattled. A murmur of fear replaced earlier arrogance. The businessman across from them muttered, "This can't be happening." But it was. The plane wasn't falling. It was arguing with itself. Elias could feel it in the vibration pattern, engine data feeding inconsistent parameters to flight control software. If the redundancy bridge didn't engage properly, automated correction loops would escalate, which meant greater instability. Graham's voice, once edged with superiority, trembled now. "You said it's safe." "It can be," he replied evenly. The cockpit door opened suddenly. Not fully, just enough for Maris to slip through again. Her composure had vanished. "The captain wants to see you, immediately." Every eye in first class turned. Graham stared at him as if seeing him for the first time, not as an intruder, but as a variable she hadn't calculated. He squeezed Lila's hand once more. "Stay seated. I'll be right back." She nodded, though fear shimmered in her eyes. He stepped into the aisle, The engine noise seemed louder there, rawer. The faint smell of overheated circuitry threaded through recycled cabin air, barely detectable unless you knew it. He knew it. As he approached the cockpit door, another automated correction jerked the aircraft subtly off axis before stabilizing again. Inside, beyond that reinforced barrier, systems were colliding. Maris pulled the door wider. Captain Rowan Mercer stood over illuminated panels alive with blinking amber lights. Sweat beaded along his hairline. "You said synchronization delay," the captain said without preamble. "Explain." Elias stepped inside, and the door sealed behind him. The cockpit door sealed with a heavy mechanical click, shutting out the murmurs of first class and trapping him inside a chamber glowing amber. Panels blinked in uneven rhythm. Warning tones layered over engine hum. Captain Rowan Mercer stood rigid, one hand braced against the console while the first officer ran rapid diagnostics across 3 separate displays. "Talk," Mercer said. Elias stepped forward, eyes scanning instinctively. The primary flight display flickered between stable and recalculating. Engine control data lagged half a second behind navigation inputs. "There," he said, pointing to the subtle offset between thrust response and yaw correction. "Your FADEC isn't syncing cleanly with the flight management system." The first officer shot him a look. "We rebooted Channel B." "That's the problem," Elias replied calmly. "This model cross-feeds Channel B into the redundancy bridge. If the bridge is catching noise from the engine control loop, it'll overcorrect." Mercer studied him sharply. "You're speaking like you've sat in this seat." "Not this one," he answered. "But close enough." Another shudder passed through the fuselage, not violent, but enough to rattle a headset against the console. Outside the cockpit, a ripple of alarmed voices swelled and then quieted again. Mercer's jaw tightened. "What's your background?" "Flight Systems Engineering, Air Force." "How long ago?" "Long enough to know this architecture hasn't changed much." The first officer exhaled slowly. "If he's right about the bridge." "He is," Elias said quietly. "Not arrogance. Certainty." A red indicator blinked briefly before returning to amber. Engine 2 thrust variance spiked and then dipped again. Mercer made a decision. "All right, say we're dealing with cross-channel interference. What's your fix?" "Manual stabilization bridge override," Elias answered. "But not full disengagement. Partial isolate the engine loop first. If you hard cut, the autopilot will spike harder." The first officer hesitated. "That's not standard passenger advice." "I'm not a standard passenger." A beat of silence followed. Another correction jolted the aircraft slightly left before systems compensated. Mercer looked at him again, really looked, measuring tone, breathing, composure. "Do you know this aircraft?" the captain asked. "Yes." "How?" Elias glanced at the model designation etched subtly near the panel. "Because I helped test its redundancy integration before it entered commercial service." The words hung there. Outside, another tremor rippled through the fuselage. Mercer didn't ask for credentials. He didn't have time. "Walk me through it," the captain said. Elias stepped closer, careful not to interfere physically. "Isolate engine control feedback from navigation channel 2. Reduce sensitivity threshold on correction loop, then engage manual stabilization bridge at 40%. The first officer's fingers hovered over switches. "If this backfires." "It won't," Elias said quietly. "But do it gradually." Mercer nodded once. "Do it." Switches clicked. The alarm tone shifted pitch, then steadied. The aircraft dipped slightly, deeper than before, causing loose items in the cockpit to slide inches across flat surfaces. In the cabin, a sharp collective gasp echoed faintly through the reinforced door. 40% bridge engaged, the first officer reported. The vibration pattern changed, not gone, but smoother. Elias listened, not with his ears alone, but with memory. He'd felt this architecture respond under stress before. He knew its temperament. "Ease engine 2 output by 3%, he added. "That's below cruise efficiency," the first officer said. "For now," Elias replied. "You're not optimizing, you're stabilizing." Mercer gave the nod. Another adjustment. The tremor beneath their feet softened, less argumentative, more aligned. Warning lights blinked once, twice. Then 2 of them faded back to green. The cockpit grew quieter, not silent, but manageable. Mercer exhaled slowly. Engine sync delay, narrowing. Elias allowed himself the smallest breath of relief. Outside, the alarm pulse that had echoed faintly earlier dropped away entirely. In the cabin, tension still hung thick, but the violent undercurrent had receded. The first officer checked secondary displays. Navigation redundancy stabilized. Mercer looked at Elias again, something new in his expression. Respect. "Who are you?" the captain asked, this time not as interrogation, but recognition forming. Elias met his gaze evenly. "Just someone who doesn't like unfinished systems." Mercer almost smiled, but stopped himself. Professional composure returned. "We'll maintain manual bridge until descent." "Smart," Elias replied. The aircraft now felt different, steadier, more cooperative. The hum beneath their feet settled into proper symmetry. Mercer reached toward the intercom switch, then paused. "They're scared out there," he said quietly. "And there's been tension." Elias thought briefly of Graham's earlier smirk, of Lila's small voice asking if they were in the wrong seats. "This isn't about me," he said. Mercer studied him for a long second. Then he pressed the intercom button. The cabin speakers crackled to life. The intercom crackled, filling the cabin with a soft burst of static that silenced every whisper in first class. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Mercer began, voice steady now, "we've successfully stabilized a minor system synchronization issue." A wave of restrained relief rippled through the aircraft. Shoulders loosened, breaths released. But the captain wasn't finished. "I'd also like to acknowledge a passenger on board who provided critical technical insight during this situation." In the cockpit, Elias stiffened slightly. "That's not necessary," he murmured. Mercer met his eyes briefly. "It is." Back in first class, Graham sat upright, confusion knitting her brow. She hadn't yet connected the dots. To her, expertise wore tailored suits and introduced itself loudly. The captain continued. "A former Air Force flight systems engineer and test pilot recognized the synchronization anomaly and advised our crew through a manual stabilization bridge engagement." The cabin fell completely silent. In the aisle, Maris stepped aside as the cockpit door opened. Elias emerged. For a moment, no one reacted. They were still processing the words. Air Force, Flight Systems Engineer, Test Pilot. Graham's face drained of color as understanding struck. Her gaze snapped to him, disbelief battling pride. The captain's voice carried on overhead. "His name is Elias Vance." There it was. His name traveled through first class like a physical force. The same air that had carried laughter now held recognition. Lila's eyes widened. She looked at her father as if seeing a layer she'd only sensed before. A businessman across the aisle whispered, "You've got to be kidding me." Graham opened her mouth slightly, then closed it again. The champagne glass in her hand trembled almost imperceptibly. Elias moved calmly down the aisle toward his seat, every step measured. He didn't scan faces. He didn't search for reactions. His focus was singular. Lila. She stood halfway from her seat, pride flooding her expression. "Dad? That was you?" He knelt slightly beside her. "Yeah. You fixed it?" "Helped." The seatbelt sign remained illuminated, but tension had shifted shape. What had been superiority now curdled into something closer to awe. Maris followed him back, her voice warm and unguarded. "Thank you," she said softly enough for only him to hear. He nodded once. As he settled back into his seat, the engine hum sounded clean now, symmetrical, balanced. The earlier argument between systems had resolved into cooperation. Graham leaned slightly across the aisle, composure struggling to reassemble itself. You never mentioned. You didn't ask," he replied evenly. Her lips pressed thin. A passenger 2 rows back began clapping hesitantly. Another joined. The applause grew, not thunderous, but genuine. Elias felt heat rise to his face. He wasn't built for spectacle. His victories had always been quiet, technical, unseen, disciplined. But this one unfolded under crystal lighting and designer suits. The irony wasn't lost on him. Captain Mercer's voice returned briefly. "We'll continue to monitor systems as we proceed to destination. Thank you for your patience." The intercom clicked off. Conversation resumed slowly, but altered. The earlier tone of casual condescension had evaporated. Now people stole glances at him, recalculating narratives they'd formed minutes ago. Lila leaned closer. "They were wrong." He smiled faintly. "About what?" "About you." He brushed her hair back gently. "People guess before they know." "Are you mad?" He considered the question. Across the aisle, Graham avoided eye contact now, staring rigidly at the seatback screen that wasn't playing anything. "No," he said. "I'm not." A few rows back, someone murmured, "Air Force." "Wow," another voice asked quietly. "Did he design this plane?" The words traveled like ripples. Graham shifted again, then finally spoke. Quieter this time. "I suppose I misjudged." He didn't answer immediately. The aircraft remained stable, engines humming with disciplined rhythm. The crisis had not exploded, but it had been real, and so had the dismissal before it. He turned slightly toward her. "You didn't have enough information." It wasn't accusation. It was fact. Her jaw tightened subtly. "Still." Silence stretched between them, not hostile now, but reflective. Up front, Maris caught his eye again and offered a small nod of respect before resuming service. As beverage carts rolled once more down the aisle, first class felt different. The space hadn't changed, but perception had. He leaned back into his seat. The victory wasn't complete yet. Public exposure had begun, but transformation required something deeper than shock. Outside the window, clouds stretched in endless white layers beneath a steady wing. And for the first time since boarding, the cabin was truly quiet. The applause faded into an awkward hush, replaced by the soft clink of glassware and the steady, disciplined hum of engines now running in clean symmetry. Elias settled back fully into his seat, the adrenaline draining from his muscles in slow, controlled waves. He didn't look around to measure reactions. He didn't need to. The shift in the air was palpable, like pressure equalizing after a storm. Across the aisle, Graham Holloway finally turned toward him. Her confidence hadn't vanished, but it had recalibrated. The sharpness in her posture softened into something more human, less armored. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. The words seemed unfamiliar in her mouth. He regarded her evenly. "For what?" "For assuming," she replied, the admission measured. "For laughing." Lila watched the exchange with wide, unblinking eyes. Elias rested his forearms lightly on the armrests. "It happens. That doesn't excuse it." "No," he agreed calmly. "It doesn't." A faint vibration passed through the cabin. Normal cruise turbulence this time. No alarms, no strain, just air currents shifting around aluminum and engineering. Graham exhaled slowly. "You didn't correct us." "I didn't need to." Her brow furrowed. Most people would have. Most people feel the need to prove something. And you don't? He glanced at his daughter before answering. Not to strangers. The statement lingered longer than the engine hum. In the aisle, Maris resumed beverage service with restored composure. She paused beside Elias's row. Captain asked me to extend his thanks again, she said softly. He nodded. Tell him systems should hold steady as long as Engine 2 stays slightly under cruise optimization. Maris blinked. You're still monitoring it? He gave the faintest shrug. Habit. She smiled, this time not professionally, but sincerely, and moved on. Behind them, murmured conversations had changed tone entirely. Air Force engineer. Test pilot. Unbelievable. The same mouths that had smirked now whispered admiration. Graham folded her hands carefully in her lap. You designed aircraft systems, and you're flying commercial alone with your daughter? Not alone, he corrected gently. She hesitated. I meant without fanfare. He almost smiled. It's just travel. But you could afford private. Probably, he said. But she likes watching the wing. Lila nodded enthusiastically, relieved to be included again. You can see everything from here. Graham studied them in silence. Something internal was shifting, subtle but real. The metrics she usually relied on to measure worth, brand, position, visible influence, had failed her mid-air. Power had come from the man she'd dismissed. I work with founders every day, she said after a moment. I pride myself on reading people, spotting potential. And? He prompted softly. And I missed completely. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't press advantage. He simply let the truth settle. Another passenger leaned slightly into the aisle. Mr. Vance, he said carefully. Thank you. That was impressive. Elias inclined his head. Team effort. The businessman shook his head. Still. Across the aisle, Graham's gaze lowered briefly before lifting again with new steadiness. I'd like to know more about your work, she said. Why? Because clearly I don't know enough. There was no arrogance left in her tone now, only curiosity edged with humility. He considered her for a moment. The aircraft remained stable. The crisis had passed. But the social imbalance that began this flight was still recalibrating. Engineering isn't glamorous, he said. It's mostly about anticipating failure before it becomes visible. She absorbed that. That's applicable beyond planes, she murmured. He didn't respond. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as crew adjusted for cruising comfort. Outside the window, sunlight poured across endless cloud cover, bright and indifferent to human hierarchies. Lila leaned into him. Dad? Yeah? I'm glad they know now. He brushed her hair gently from her face. Me too. Graham watched that small exchange and looked away, not out of dismissal this time, but reflection. Moments passed, then the intercom clicked again, softer than before. Mr. Vance, Captain Mercer's voice said, would you mind remaining on board briefly after landing? Our maintenance team would appreciate speaking with you. Heads turned again. Public recognition extended beyond gratitude. It became institutional acknowledgement. Elias nodded once, though the captain couldn't see it. Graham exhaled quietly. Seems the world is catching up. Maybe, he said. The engines continued their smooth, disciplined rhythm. What began as laughter had become recalibration, not just of machinery, but of perception. And somewhere beneath the steady hum of stabilized systems, dignity had been restored in full view of everyone who once doubted it. The intercom clicked off, but the words lingered in the cabin like a final adjustment settling into place. Maintenance would be waiting. That meant documentation, reports, names recorded in official logs. The recognition would not fade with landing. It would be written into the aircraft's operational history. Elias felt that weight, though he didn't show it. Beside him, Lila swung her feet lightly now, fear replaced with restless pride. "Do I get to meet the captain again?" "Probably," he said. "Can I tell him thank you too?" "You can." Across the aisle, Graham's posture had softened entirely. The rigid lines of executive certainty were gone. In their place was contemplation. "I've funded aerospace startups," she said after a while. "Sat through hundreds of pitches. I look for confidence, clarity, command of detail." He listened without comment. "And yet," she continued, almost to herself, "you never once felt the need to announce any of that." "No one asked," he replied evenly. "That's not why people announce things." "Then why?" "To establish position." He met her gaze calmly. "Position establishes itself." The statement wasn't boastful. It was observational. The aircraft cruised steadily through high-altitude currents. No flickers, no tremors. The earlier tension felt almost surreal now, like a storm remembered from behind reinforced glass. Passengers resumed normal conversation, but with altered tone. When eyes drifted toward Elias, they carried curiosity rather than judgment. Graham studied him openly now, recalibrating. "You left the Air Force?" "Yes." "Why?" He didn't hesitate. "Family." Lila leaned closer into his side at that single word. Graham nodded slowly. "That's rare." "Not really." She glanced toward the window, sunlight reflecting faintly against her diamond watch. "In my world, stepping back from prestige is seen as weakness." "In mine," he said quietly, "it's clarity." The difference settled between them like a new altitude. A light chime sounded, crew preparing for gradual descent in the coming hour. The engines subtly shifted pitch, almost imperceptible to most. He noticed, of course. "You still monitoring it?" Graham asked. "Always," he replied. "Even after it's stable?" "Especially then." She absorbed that carefully. A few rows back, a younger passenger leaned forward slightly. "Sir, were you really a test pilot?" "Yes." "That's incredible." He offered a polite nod. The conversation ripple grew again, questions forming, admiration building, but it never crossed into spectacle. The tone remained respectful, restrained. The social temperature had fully inverted. Where laughter once traveled easily, humility now moved cautiously. Lila tugged at his sleeve. "Dad, when they laughed before, did it hurt?" He considered her honestly. "A little." She frowned. "Why didn't you say something?" "Because sometimes," he said gently, "the best answer isn't words." She thought about that, then smiled faintly. "It's actions." "Yeah." Across the aisle, Graham's eyes flickered at that exchange. She wasn't just witnessing competence, she was witnessing values. "I misread strength," she said quietly. He didn't contradict her. The cabin lights brightened slightly as clouds thinned below. Land would be visible soon. The flight attendants moved with renewed ease, no longer masking concern. Captain Mercer's voice returned briefly. "We'll begin our descent shortly. Thank you for your cooperation earlier." Earlier. It already felt distant, but its impact remained immediate. Graham turned toward him again. "When we land, I'd like to connect properly. No assumptions this time." He studied her a moment. "For what purpose?" he asked calmly. She didn't bristle at the question. "Perspective," she said. "I think I need some." He considered that. The aircraft tilted gently as descent began, gravity shifting subtly against their bodies. Lila pressed her face toward the window, spotting land emerging through broken clouds. He felt the smooth response of engines adjusting under controlled reduction. The stabilization bridge held firm. Public exposure had done its work. But transformation, true transformation, was still unfolding quietly in the space between apology and understanding. As the runway grew closer in the distance, Graham rested her hands calmly in her lap, not as a ruler of the cabin anymore, but as someone who had learned something she hadn't expected to learn. And beside her, the man she had laughed at watched the wing cut steadily through descending air, composed as ever. The runway stretched ahead like a silver ribbon cutting through late afternoon haze. Landing gear deployed with a familiar mechanical thud, followed by the low hydraulic whine that only someone who'd lived around aircraft would instinctively measure. Elias felt the shift through his feet before he heard it. "Gear sounds clean," he murmured, almost to himself. Graham glanced at him. "You can tell?" "Yeah." Lila pressed her forehead lightly against the window. "We're really okay, right?" "We are," he assured her. The aircraft descended steadily, engines balanced, systems aligned. The earlier instability felt almost theoretical now, except for the way it had reshaped the entire cabin. First class was quieter than it had been all flight. Not tense, just thoughtful. Graham cleared her throat. "I've spent years believing I can assess someone in seconds," she said. "It's efficient. It's profitable." "And today?" he asked. Today, efficiency failed. He didn't offer reassurance. Growth rarely came with comfort. The wheels met the runway with a firm but controlled impact. Reverse thrust roared, vibrating through the cabin, strong, symmetrical, disciplined. The aircraft slowed without deviation. A collective exhale passed through every seat. Applause erupted again, louder this time, not just for landing, but for what had unfolded mid-air. Lila clapped enthusiastically, pride unfiltered. Elias allowed himself a small smile. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Captain Mercer's voice returned once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the entire crew, thank you for your patience. And once again, special thanks to Mr. Vance for his extraordinary assistance today." There was no mistaking the tone now. Public, official acknowledgement. Heads turned openly. This time, Elias didn't shrink from it. He simply nodded once, accepting the recognition without embellishment. If this story moved you so far, subscribe with the bell on, because moments like this remind us what quiet strength really looks like. The aircraft rolled to a smooth stop at the gate. The seatbelt sign chimed off, but no one stood immediately. They were waiting. The cockpit door opened before anyone could reach for luggage. Captain Mercer stepped out into first class, uniform crisp, expression resolute. He walked directly to Elias. "Sir," Mercer said, extending his hand firmly, "on behalf of my crew and every passenger on board, thank you." Elias rose to meet him, shaking his hand with equal steadiness. "Happy to help." The handshake wasn't theatrical. It was professional recognition between equals. Graham watched the exchange carefully. No one laughed now. No one whispered. The hierarchy had inverted fully, not through humiliation, but through competence under pressure. Mercer turned slightly so the cabin could hear. "Maintenance will want a word. We'd value your insight before next departure." "Of course," Elias replied. Lila beamed up at the captain. "He listens to planes," she said proudly. Mercer smiled warmly. "That he does." Passengers began standing then, but movement was slower, more deliberate. Several individuals offered quiet thanks as they filed past. A businessman paused. "You handled that with remarkable restraint." Elias inclined his head. "No need to panic what you can solve." Across the aisle, Graham remained seated a moment longer, watching as people deferred to the man she had dismissed an hour earlier. When the aisle cleared slightly, she stood and stepped toward him. "I'd like to apologize properly," she said. He met her gaze calmly. "I measured you by appearance," she continued, "and I was wrong." "Yes," he said, not unkindly. The directness startled her, but she didn't retreat. "I can't undo the laughter," she added, "but I can correct how I move forward." He studied her for a moment. There was no sarcasm in her tone now, no defensiveness, only recalibration. "That's all anyone can do," he replied. Lila slipped her hand into his again as passengers slowly disembarked. Graham hesitated, then extended her hand. Not as a social superior, as an equal. He shook it once, firm, brief. Public exposure had done more than reveal his credentials. It had revealed character, hers included. As the line toward the jet bridge thinned, sunlight streamed through the open aircraft door, illuminating the cabin in warm gold. The same seats, the same carpet, the same overhead bins. But the atmosphere had changed completely. And as Elias prepared to step into the jet bridge beside his daughter, he knew the final transformation would unfold just beyond that doorway. Sunlight poured through the open aircraft door, washing the first-class cabin in a warm glow that felt nothing like the sterile lighting from earlier. Elias stepped into the aisle with Lila beside him, her small hand wrapped confidently around his. The line toward the jet bridge moved slowly, passengers deliberately giving him space, not out of avoidance, but respect. Behind them, Graham followed at a measured distance. The jet bridge hummed faintly underfoot as they crossed into the terminal corridor. The scent shifted from recycled cabin air to the cleaner, brighter smell of polished floors and distant coffee. Just beyond the aircraft door, two maintenance supervisors waited, tablets in hand. Their posture was professional but eager. "Mr. Vance?" one asked. "Yes. We've already reviewed the captain's preliminary report. You engaged partial stabilization bridge at 40%? "That's right." The supervisor nodded, impressed. "That's not common knowledge outside development teams." "I know," Elias replied simply. Passengers walking past slowed, pretending not to listen. The maintenance lead continued. "Would you mind stepping aside for a few minutes to walk us through what you observed during climb?" "Of course." He crouched slightly toward Lila. "Stay right here, okay?" She nodded, chin high. "I'll wait." Graham lingered a few feet away, watching the exchange closely. Elias moved with the maintenance team toward a side corridor near the gate podium. Their conversation remained technical. Engine feedback loops, synchronization lag, data noise between FADEC and navigation redundancy. The supervisor's respect grew visibly with every precise detail he offered. "You were part of the original integration program, weren't you?" the man asked quietly. "Yes." "That explains it." Back near the gate seating area, passengers clustered in small groups, retelling the story already. "Air Force test pilot. Helped design the plane. In first class the whole time." The narrative had solidified. Graham approached Lila cautiously. "You must be proud of your dad." Lila nodded instantly. "He always knows what to do." "That's rare," Graham said softly. "He says planes talk," Lila added. Graham smiled faintly. "Seems he listens." Across the gate area, Elias finished the final explanation. The maintenance supervisor extended his hand firmly. "We'd like to credit your insight in our official report." "That's not necessary," Elias replied. "It is," the supervisor insisted. "It improves fleet safety." He gave a small nod. "Then do what helps the system." The men thanked him again before stepping away to coordinate with ground operations. As Elias returned toward Lila, the crowd subtly parted. Graham stepped forward, no longer hesitant. "I'd like to say something before you leave." He stopped, expression neutral but attentive. "I build companies," she said steadily. "Or I try to. I invest in people who see what others miss. He waited. Today, she continued, you saw what no one else heard. Not because you were louder, but because you were listening. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but honest. I misjudged you, she added plainly. Yes, he replied again, calm as before. She nodded once, accepting it without defensiveness. I won't make that mistake twice. He considered her words. People often promised change when confronted publicly. Few followed through. We'll see, he said. The honesty startled her, but she respected it. Lila tugged his sleeve. Can we go see the runway? In a minute. Graham glanced between them. If you're ever open to conversation about engineering, about leadership, here. She extended a business card. He looked at it briefly before taking it. I don't chase titles, he said. I know, she replied. That's why I'm asking. A faint smile touched his expression. Behind them, a few remaining passengers approached one by one, offering quiet thanks. No cameras, no spectacle, just acknowledgement. Public exposure had done its work fully now, not through humiliation, but through clarity. The social order that boarded the aircraft no longer existed. Elias slipped the card into his jacket pocket, not as validation, but as possibility. Ready? He asked Lila. She nodded eagerly. They turned toward the wide terminal windows overlooking the runway. Aircraft taxied in disciplined lines beneath open sky. As they walked, Graham remained where she stood, watching them. Not with superiority, not with envy, but with reflection. For the first time that day, she understood something simple and unsettling. Real authority doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself when it's needed most. The terminal windows stretched floor to ceiling, framing the runway in bands of silver and heat shimmer. Elias and Lila stood side by side, watching another aircraft lift into the sky. The roar rolled faintly through the glass, distant but powerful. That one sounds smooth, Lila said confidently. He smiled. It does. Behind them, footsteps approached, measured, unhurried. Graham stopped a few feet away, no longer intruding, just present. I've never actually listened to a plane before, she admitted. You probably have, he said without turning. Just not on purpose. She stepped closer to the glass. When you said earlier that engineering is about anticipating failure, that stayed with me. He nodded slightly. In my industry, she continued, we chase growth, speed, visibility. We reward people who speak first. And, he prompted, and maybe we should reward the ones who listen longer. He finally looked at her. There was no trace of the woman who had laughed at him in first class. The sharp edge had softened into something more grounded, less certain but more aware. Perspective doesn't cost anything, he said quietly, but pride does. She absorbed that without argument. Lila turned toward them. Are you friends now? The question disarmed them both. Graham gave a small, honest laugh. I'm hoping to earn that. Elias studied her a moment longer. Friendship isn't earned in one conversation. I know, she said, but humility can start in one. He didn't smile this time, but he didn't dismiss her either. Across the runway, ground crews moved with efficient choreography. Every motion mattered. Every signal carried weight. That's what I admire about aviation, he said after a moment. Everyone has a role. No one's invisible. Graham glanced at him. Except in first class. The honesty of that landed. He met her gaze steadily. Visibility and value aren't the same thing. She nodded once. Silence settled between them again, not tense, reflective. A maintenance vehicle rolled toward the aircraft they had just exited. Even from this distance, Elias could see technicians preparing for inspection. Systems would be reviewed, logs updated. The partial stabilization bridge engagement would be analyzed and documented. Accountability, transparency, process. Graham folded her arms lightly.
I built my reputation on reading rooms, she said. Today I realized I was only reading surfaces.
Most people do, he replied. Not you.
I read patterns, he corrected gently. She considered that. A boarding announcement echoed faintly through the terminal for another departing flight. Life moved on quickly around them, unaware of the recalibration that had occurred mid-air. Lila tugged his sleeve again. Can we get something to eat? He chuckled softly. Yeah, we can. Graham hesitated. Before you go, may I ask one more thing? He gave a small nod. When they laughed at you, she said, voice steady, what did you feel? He answered without hesitation. Protective. Not angry?
A little. He glanced at Lila. But anger wastes time. And today? Today, he said quietly. She saw what matters. Lila beamed faintly, understanding more than most adults would. Graham inhaled slowly, as if recalibrating herself entirely. Thank you, she said, not for the aircraft, not for the embarrassment, but for the lesson. He didn't respond with words this time. He didn't need to. The transformation had already occurred. Public exposure had corrected perception. Competence had dismantled arrogance. And humility, earned the hard way, had replaced laughter. As Elias took Lila's hand and turned toward the concourse, Graham remained by the window a moment longer. The runway shimmered beneath afternoon light. Somewhere behind her polished exterior, something fundamental had shifted. And for once, she was listening. They hadn't taken more than a few steps toward the food court when a voice called out behind them. Mr. Vance? Elias turned. Captain Mercer was striding across the terminal floor, cap tucked under his arm now, formality eased but presence still unmistakable. Captain, Elias acknowledged. Mercer extended his hand again, this time less official, more personal. Maintenance confirmed your assessment. Engine 2's feedback sensor was sending intermittent noise into the redundancy channel. Your partial bridge engagement prevented a full autopilot disconnect. Elias nodded once. Glad it held. It did more than hold, Mercer said. You likely prevented a diversion. Maybe worse. A few nearby travelers slowed, recognizing the uniform, recognizing the man beside him. The story was spreading beyond first class now, carried in fragments of overheard praise. Lila looked up at the captain. He said it was just helping. Mercer smiled warmly. Sometimes helping is the difference between routine and emergency. He straightened slightly, addressing Elias again. Airline operations will be reaching out formally. I've already filed your name in the incident report. That's fine, Elias replied. Just make sure the fix is logged properly. Mercer's eyes sharpened with appreciation. Already done. There was a brief pause, not awkward but respectful. I've flown this aircraft for years, the captain added. Today reminded me that expertise doesn't always sit in uniform. Elias offered a faint smile. Uniforms just make it easier to spot. Mercer chuckled softly. Safe travels, Mr. Vance. And you, Captain. They shook hands once more before Mercer stepped back, returning toward crew corridors. The surrounding onlookers dispersed slowly, murmuring to one another. No one laughed now. No one questioned belonging. Graham approached from a short distance away. She had witnessed the exchange silently. They're documenting it, she said quietly. Yes. That means it becomes part of record. It becomes part of safety, he corrected. She nodded. For a moment, the three of them, venture capitalist, engineer, child, stood in the flow of terminal traffic,
the noise of rolling suitcases and overhead announcements weaving around them. Graham looked at Lila. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Lila thought seriously. "Someone who listens." The answer struck both adults differently. Graham's lips curved faintly. "That's a rare goal." "It shouldn't be," Elias said. A departure board nearby flickered with updated times and destinations. Life continued at relentless speed, indifferent to lessons learned mid-flight. Graham took a slow breath. "I won't pretend today didn't challenge me." "It was supposed to," he replied calmly. She didn't argue. "I built my career on decisive judgment," she continued. "But judgment without curiosity becomes arrogance." He studied her face. She wasn't performing remorse anymore. She was dissecting it. "That's fixable," he said. She gave a small, genuine nod. "I hope so." Silence settled once more, but this time it felt complete. Public exposure had shifted perception in the cabin. Institutional acknowledgement had reinforced it here. Now what remained was personal transformation. Quieter, less visible, but more lasting. Graham extended her hand one final time. "Thank you, Elias." He shook it firmly. This time, there was no power imbalance in the gesture, just mutual recognition. As she turned to leave, she paused briefly. "For what it's worth, I won't laugh first next time." He inclined his head. "That's a start." She walked away toward the executive lounge, posture thoughtful rather than commanding. Elias watched her go for a second, then felt Lila tug at his hand again. "Food now?" she asked hopefully. He laughed softly. "Food now." They moved into the current of travelers, blending into the ordinary rhythm of the terminal. No cameras followed them. No grand speeches echoed overhead. Just a father and his daughter walking side by side. Behind them, the aircraft they'd flown would be inspected, recalibrated, logged into maintenance systems with precision. The temporary flaw corrected. The data updated. But something else had been recalibrated too. Perception. And that correction might last longer than any software patch. As they disappeared into the crowd, the runway beyond the glass shimmered under steady light, ready for the next departure, the next test, the next moment when quiet expertise would matter more than visible status. The food court buzzed with ordinary life, coffee grinders whirring, trays sliding across counters, distant boarding calls echoing overhead. Elias sat across from Lila with 2 paper cups of hot chocolate between them. The chaos of the terminal swirled around their small table, but the intensity of the flight had softened into something reflective. Lila stirred her drink thoughtfully. "Dad?" "Yeah?" "When they laughed at you, I felt small." He didn't interrupt. "But when the captain said your name," she looked up, eyes steady now, "I felt tall." The words settled deeper than any applause had. He leaned forward slightly. "You were never small." "It didn't feel like that." "I know." He nodded gently. "That's why you don't decide who you are based on who's laughing." She absorbed that quietly. Across the terminal, planes lifted and landed in steady rhythm. Announcements rose and fell like background music to human stories unfolding every minute. "What if they never found out?" she asked. "About the plane?" "About you." He considered that carefully. "Then we would have still known." She smiled faintly. He continued, voice calm but firm. "Respect isn't about being announced. It's about being prepared when it matters." She took a slow sip of hot chocolate, then nodded as if sealing that truth somewhere permanent. A few travelers passed their table, casting glances of recognition. Word had traveled further than expected, but there were no interruptions now, only quiet acknowledgement. Elias watched his daughter for a moment longer, then leaned back in his chair. "They laughed because they thought they understood the story," he said. "But they didn't," she replied.
Exactly. Outside the wide terminal windows, another aircraft began its takeoff roll, engines rising into powerful harmony. He listened automatically. Clean. Aligned. The system was holding. Somewhere in another part of the airport, Graham Holloway was likely sitting in a lounge, reviewing emails, recalculating more than investment portfolios. He wondered briefly if the lesson would stay with her once comfort returned fully. He hoped so, because today hadn't just been about a plane. It had been about assumption, about how easily people measure worth by surface details, clothing, seats, posture, silence, and how quickly that measurement collapses when real skill enters the equation.
Lila finished her drink and wiped her mouth carefully. "Can we fly first class again sometime?"
He smiled.
"Maybe."
She tilted her head.
"Will they laugh again?"
"Maybe," he said honestly. She grinned.
"That's okay."
He laughed softly at that, because now she understood something she hadn't before boarding that aircraft. Laughter doesn't define you. Preparation does. They stood, tossing their cups away, and began walking toward their connecting gate. As they moved through the terminal crowd, just another father and daughter among hundreds, there was no spotlight, no applause, only steady steps and quiet confidence. Before we close this story, let me ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated in a room that thought it had you figured out? Ask me for the next story title, and I'll tell you another one that hits just as hard. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. They mocked the quiet mechanic at the gala, until the mayor announced who built the city's bridges. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?